Welcome to the Season 3 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar and is presented by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from the rural India. In the recent years, heat waves in India have become more frequent, intense, and longer lasting. This increase can be attributed to the larger problem of global warming and climate change. Rising greenhouse gas emissions have led to a rise in average global temperatures, which directly contribute to the occurrence and severity of heat waves. In order to understand the importance of heat action plans and implications of extreme weather, we spoke to Aditya Valiathan Pillai, a fellow with the Initiative for Climate, Energy and Environment (ICEE) at the Centre for Policy Research (CPR). His current work focuses on strengthening policies to combat extreme heat.
Thank you so much for joining us here at the India Energy Hour. We are absolutely delighted to have you here. We have seen your work over the years and we have been very, very amazed by it. Learned a lot. So good to have you here and talk about such an important issue that we all are going through. Me and you sitting here in Delhi are absolutely really undergoing this. So thanks again for joining us here.
No, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Very, very excited to be on the podcast, which I've listened to quite a bit. So, yeah.
Before we delve into the topic, I want our listeners to know a little bit about you. You have worked at the cross section of water, energy, climate issues. You have worked across states as well. What got you interested in these areas? And if you could also go back a little and tell us where are you from? What did you study? How did you land up in these sectors? We'd love to know.
Yeah. It's a series of fortunate accidents, I think. I mean, none of this was planned, but, reasonably glad I'm here finally. Because it's one of those things where I think the place you grow up has a lot to do with what you're interested in. And I was quite lucky to grow up in a very beautiful part of the country, which is in coastal Karnataka. So it was this small town called Manipal. It was a village, it was a panchayat officially when we were growing up. I think it's changed now. But of course, I think most people know it for the university, which is where my parents taught. So it was this nice existence right between the sea and the Western Ghats. It's kind of sandwiched between these two things. So it rains for 5 months a year. It's very green and verdant and plush. And quite a nice place to grow up. And I think that sort of imprints on a person. And that sense of connection with nature is actually quite strong. So being in a city like Delhi, where there isn't a water body you can submerge yourself in for about 150 kilometers on all sides, is a bit of a challenge, I think, for a lot of people who've grown up out there in the world. But it's also a place that's being quite heavily impacted by climate change. And I think one of my first kind of visual memories was I was doing a report on coastal erosion in a place called Ullal, which is just south of Mangalore, just north of the Kerala border. It's kind of one of the more backward parts of an otherwise very rich and well-to-do part of the country in terms of the general, per capita incomes and the level of urban density and so on. And it was quite incredible, right? I mean, it's sort of forgotten by the state. Houses are disappearing into the sea. Tube wells are filled with salt water. People have to, once a tube well is filled with salt water, seawater, that's it, right? The entire settlement is done. And it also, I think, became very apparent to me at that time that there's almost nothing policy in the state can do. And so at that time, I was studying journalism and I was very keen on being a journalist. And I mean, that's still a part of me that's very much alive, I think. And, occasionally I like to try doing a little bit of non-policy, non-academic writing. I was quite keen on focusing on security and state stability, and those things became quite central to me. And I think that's why climate change started appealing quite a bit. So I did my master's in international relations and political science. And one of the questions that really provoked me at that time was, what's the future of South Asia like from a state stability perspective? And I was asked by my professor, Christophe Jaffalo, who's a very keen observer of South Asia. I was asked by him to think about that in the context of Pakistan. And that was a time people were very concerned about terrorism. People were very concerned about circular debt, the fact that the electricity sector wasn't functioning. I mean, that was before Chinese investments in hydropower up in the north, right? But then this is also just after the IPCC 4 drama around the fact that the glaciers were going to disappear very, very soon, which eventually they walked that back because it turned out it was unsound science. But it was right after the Glacier Gate controversy, and India responded very badly and so on. But it did provoke, I think, an interest in what the glaciers of the Himalayas meant for the future of South Asia. And that, I think, is where my sort of keenness in climate change began. And CPR is actually the only place that I know of that actually worked on transboundary river governance emanating from the Himalayas. So parts of the Ganga Treaty and the Mahakali Treaty actually were worked on in the CPR conference room in the 1990s. And so I was just very keen on working at the Center for Policy Research, and then things just took their own course.
It's a very natural sort of progression for you from a coastal town to now studying really, I mean, if I can characterize adaptation and resilience, climate resilience and adaptation broad. Have you done work on mitigation as well, or you've really focused on, managing the climate?
No, I have done some work on mitigation, but then again, through the river side of things, because Himalayan rivers are not only about the irrigation and the cities on it, but also about the energy that's produced. And around the time I was getting into this, the early part of the 2010s, there's also this big excitement about hydropower in the Himalayas. And I think then there was still a sense that this would be like a battery for future energy in the country. So that's actually my first exposure to the whole mitigation debate. And then more recently at CPR, we've been doing a lot of work on trying to understand how institutions and governance for the energy sector should be structured. So a lot of that doesn't deal with, the nitty-gritty of the policy world, but it's generally about how one handles these different political pressures that are constantly buffeting the energy space, especially when now there's this huge need to decarbonize, right? Which both of you are really experts at. It's been from these two kind of perspectives, the mitigation side of the conversation emerge.
Great. I think we can go on and on about your, personal side. I'm also keen to start to talk about the topic of the day, which is about, how to manage heat in India. India is such a hot country, and, especially this summer, we are hearing so many words like heat waves, El Nino, extreme weathers, and other things. And there's multiple forecasts now, I think, which are showing variations of heat conditions and below monsoon scenarios and stuff. Give us a big picture of what all this means and how are they connected. If you can connect all the different words, and explain what's really going on the ground. And is it one of those special years, or is this going to be long lasting in the future as well?
Yeah, if you really step back from the headlines that we've seen in the last couple of years, I think the story you're going to take away from it is we as a society are brushing up against something that we haven't ever experienced before. This 1.5 degree warning that the WMO has put out, that it's more likely than not, there's a 66% chance that we'll cross the 1.5 degree threshold at least once over the next 5 years, is a recognition that we are now approaching environmental and atmospheric conditions that modern human society has never had to deal with, right? That's what it's about. And that plays out then in a range of headlines like, things about the El Nino, which is supposed to get more frequent and more intense because of global warming. and it also contributes to the worst effects of the heating. There are multiple conversations about how the El Nino interacts with climate change, but at least one strand of that conversation believes very much that it will get worse. And we have these second order impacts, right? So you have heat waves, which is when the heat gets particularly bad. And the headlines actually in the last 2 years have focused very much on that. It's kind of become almost like a proxy for everything else that's happening because it's such a direct kind of manifestation of rising global temperatures, right? Some level Arctic ice melting really quickly is abstract and remote, but the heat that your elderly grandmother feels and you have to guard against because you have to put an AC in that room is so much more direct, and you're going to read that piece of news. And so it's like heat has become a visible, tangible manifestation of that. And so you have all of this interest now in what heat is doing to society, right? So last year, we saw these unseasonal heat waves. March 2022, things got really bad. We lost about 4 or 5% of our wheat crop. And that was just as Ukraine was kicking off. There's a huge amount of demand, and at the same time, and not least because there's a drought happening in Africa. And then you have a huge supply shortfall because of geopolitical instability and Indian wheat falling off the radar. And that becomes kind of totemic. And then a few months later, you end up with India's rice production collapsing because of drought-like conditions in Jharkhand, Bihar, and Chhattisgarh. So there are wheat exports that are curtailed, and then soon after, there are broken rice and non-basmati rice exports that are curtailed, right? And then immediately after that, of course, we saw Bangalore and flooding in India's Silicon Valley, which is like attacking the very core of the promise of India and the images of Indian growth, right? And so, in a way, I think all of these headlines sort of ways of very tangibly demonstrating what an abstract number like reaching 1.5 degrees means. And so you keep getting things like this, right? You get words like El Nino becoming important one day, and urban flooding being the flavor of the season the next day. Agriculture has now popped up as a central part of it. And that's how I see the connections between these things. In a way, these are constructed connections, right? These are constructed by the media and the policy world and people who read and think about these things. Because if you step back and try to understand the abstract reality of climate change and try to think very hard and rationally about what actually is going on, then you might end up thinking about like one species of insects that's going away, and that will actually be the biggest cause of long-term instability. Right? We might be able to manage urban flooding better than we manage biodiversity loss. So all these words that pop up are actually, I think, political manifestations of a very deep anxiety and a way of understanding the world. It's a way of storytelling, in a way.
I just had a kind of follow up. I mean, you said this, but I just want to make sure that we all understand, including the audience. Like, are you also suggesting that these heat waves in India, is there evidence that it's going to only increase? And if so, to what degree? I mean, you can talk about this in the context of India, or you can talk about this in the context of larger subcontinent.
And just want to add here, not just address this as heat waves, any type of extreme weather events, because I believe, as I understand, and from what you have also said and written, that different parts of the country will face different types of extreme weather events. So not just heat waves, in terms of anything, flooding, drought, what do you think will happen? As Sandeep said, will it worsen because of global warming?
Yeah. Just starting with the heat question, there's, I think, now incontrovertible evidence the number of hot days has increased and the number of heat waves is increasing. But the problem with that, and it's possible to be, I think, maybe a little bit technical about this. I don't know how technical we should get, but there's a question about when a heat wave is declared also. That is a question, right? So I don't think we have real clarity on the number of heat waves. If you define heat waves as things that negatively affect people's health and livelihoods, I don't think we have a very clear number, but generally all these numbers are increasing. And so on the heat question, there isn't a whole lot of doubt. The best sort of guide we have for the impact story is actually the IPCC's, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Its 6th assessment report, which they just finished that cycle. There's the Working Group 2 report on impacts and adaptation. And if you sort of go through it and look at the sort of numbers they put together in terms of the impacts because of urban flooding, river flooding, glacial lake outburst floods, coastal erosion, cyclones, very importantly, and all of these things that affect India, if you focus on the India and South Asia part of the story, you have a pretty convincing picture that it's already here, right? And these aren't just projection numbers. It's already here, and there is enough data to suggest that these impacts are getting quite bad. And then you have all this anecdotal evidence about, wheat production falling 4%, maize production falling. There were districts in Punjab last year that lost 30% of their wheat production, right? Because of the unseasonal heat wave. And it even makes you think, like, what is the future of that? What is the future of that district like? I can, maybe talk through what that means also. I mean, we have some understanding of what that looks like in the future. And the IPCC for South Asia itself suggests that, we could see at least between 11 to 20% increase in the number of people at risk of hunger just because of the sort of effects on the agricultural system. It portends large-scale infrastructural losses. And overall, it talks about the possibility of losing up to 2% of GDP in South Asia more generally by 2050 and 1.8% of GDP in India due to all the various climate impacts, right? Not just extreme events, but all the various climate impacts that are likely to hit. In terms of just the extreme events in this question that you're asking about, if you add up all the different things that are buffeting the country at any given point of time, I think the best source of evidence is these German watch reports that come out from time to time. So every year they sort of compile damages across different countries. And so we kind of try to understand what's the last decade looked like. And they stopped during COVID because they weren't getting data. But if you look at it, 2013, it was 0.22% of India's GDP in terms of disaster-related damages. 2014, it was 0.49% of GDP. 2016, 0.25 again. 2018, 0.36%. And then 2019 was a big one, 0.72% of GDP. So you're seeing between 0.25 and 0.5% of GDP regularly. And then on the spike years, you're seeing it go up to about 3/4 of a percentage point. And that's when you add up all the things that have already happened, right? And then you project out into the future and you get this 2% GDP number by 2050. This is also where, as GDP is increasing, right? So it's not a static denominator. So then it gives you a sense of what the trajectory, how much the trajectory is being bent, and then who's losing the 2% of GDP, right? Especially if you don't have a social safety net, you don't have large-scale reskilling programs, and you have large amounts of geographic diversity, economic inequity, and geographical diversity in terms of sort of land features, and you're left with a picture of startling increases in inequality driven by these numbers.
Those are very stark numbers, and this is something that we wanted to address, that what is the kind of socio-economic shock that extreme weather brings, not only just at national level, but at a state level. Can you just tell us, what kind of socio-economic loss or impact we are looking at both national level and state level because of these heat waves and extreme weathers that we are talking about here? You mentioned a number, but for our listeners or for a layman, what is the loss at the ground level that we are looking at?
Yeah, heat waves are actually maybe perhaps the hardest to pinpoint exactly what the damages are, because these aren't damages to physical objects and infrastructure. These are diffuse economy-wide losses of productivity and so on. So they're probably the hardest. There have been a couple of studies to try and estimate this and try and understand, especially through the lens of loss of labor productivity. And this is essentially trying to understand how much less work a person will do in a given temperature and humidity every hour. And there are a couple of very interesting papers out there. This paper by Luke Parsons in Nature Communications, I think, which actually does this really interestingly for India, uses a very interesting methodology. And we end up with figures like the potential loss of 5% of working hours by 2030 on a fairly conservative RCP 2.6 pathway. And that's an ILO statistic. And if you look at ag alone, if you look at the agricultural sector alone, that number goes up to about 9.5, 9.6% of working hours lost just due to heat. And this is something that's been affecting the Indian economy for a very long time. So the statistic is in the mid 90s, according to that report, loss of productive labor hours was about 4.3%, which will increase to about the exact numbers 5.8% by 2030, and then double that almost for agriculture, right? So the problem is also, of course, there are a lot of India in terms of the number of people, between half and two-thirds. I mean, half and three-fourths of India's labor force is heat exposed. And that's because they work in farming, mining, construction, and a whole bunch of informal services that are also heat exposed. And it's very tricky to come up with this number. Now, obviously, structural shifts in the economy will mean that number will reduce over time. And it's predicted to reduce to, less than 50%. One number is 40% by 2030, but I think that's a very optimistic economic trajectory. So you step back, and then, there's a whole bunch of effects on the future of Indian agriculture, particularly with wheat and maize production when it comes to this. So these are core crops. Right? So you take a step back and then think, what do we have and how do we guard against this? And the first and last line of defense is this thing we call, the term of art is a heat action plan. And it's a plan that stretches across pretty much every sector of the economy, right? So heat action plans today have an ag component, a water component, a health component, a tourism component, industry component. So there are about 13, 14 different ministries and departments at the state level, at the district level, and at the city level that are concurrently trying to manage these numbers from coming to fruition, right? So the potential long-term damages. And so you're in a context where, generally local government in India is short on capacity, large number of vacancies, lack of access to expertise, so on and so forth. And now you've given it an invisible problem that is, death by 1,000 cuts, that requires massive amounts of coordination and massive amounts of science, almost like a perfect storm in terms of a public policy issue. And that's where these heat action plans come in, which is why we did this bit of research on trying to understand what heat action plans are and how they can improve, is because of this sort of problem formulations. Like, how does the state deal with a 21st century challenge that looks like this?
Great, you started talking about the report. Before we really get into the report and kind of talk about some of your key recommendations, it would be helpful to understand your methodology. Like, how many of these heat action plans, we were chatting offline before the recording, how does one jurisdiction create this heat action plan? Like, is it like a state appoints some experts and just they come up with recommendations, or is it like a series of studies, consultations? So explain to me both the methodology of how heat action plans themselves are created and what methodology you use to evaluate those plans. So I'm really getting into the methodological question of both.
I'll start with maybe how these things are created, right? This is not something we formally analyze. So pretty much everything I'm giving you is anecdotal based on the heat action plans we analyze. The people we spoke to, so we plugged into the heat community, which is very interesting, very intelligent, well-meaning community of people, I really have to say. The way it works is, this is why it's quite interesting, it's really bottom up. There is no central mandate that these plans need to be created, right? So in all other areas of climate policy, there is a central mandate that requires that states create state action plans on climate change, districts create district disaster management plans, so on and so forth. This is operating in the opposite direction, where sometimes we've seen districts basically working with their local district hospital and coming up with a set of guidance notes on what to do during a heat wave. So it doesn't really get into the state of the art of how to manage your irrigation system during a heat wave, but it will have a set of do's and don'ts. And it'll say, this is what we should do with our emergency row. This is what we should do in terms of establishing cooling centers and so on. And then there are states, like large states like UP, Maharashtra, et cetera, that work with international and national expertise, technical partners, and then create very sophisticated, broad-ranging heat action plans. So it happens differently in different places. And one of the interesting things is there is no single departmental entity that's in charge of these heat action plans if you go state by state, right? So in some states, it's a state disaster management agency. In other states, it's a revenue and disaster management department. In other states, it's the health department. So it's really, really one of those bottom-up policy responses, which then brings you to the question of why do we found 37 of them? why do 37 exist? And, by all indications, from people we've spoken to, there are a lot more that we weren't able to formally include because we didn't get access to these documents. But by all indications, there are more than that. So it's kind of interesting that heat has become this thing that organically, without huge amounts of popular pressure. So it's not as though this is a live political issue and therefore things are happening. It's not even clear that there are major political benefits, right? The parallel to this is the electric vehicle story, because that's the other policy diffusion story is pretty much bottom up. And there are clear political benefits to EVs, right? Very clear, like straight up rupee number can be put on, what you gain from an electric car, switching away from an ICE engine. And so here, there's this question about, these are future losses that are yet to be realized. And so these plans are being created. Fairly interesting. What we did with the report was we were quite keen on trying to firstly get this body of heat action plans together, because there's no single central repository of this. You hear about it in newspaper reports and so on. Occasionally you see that the state and that city has come out with a heat action plan, but there was no single source of this. So we went and spoke to a lot of these state disaster management agencies, contacted, I think, nearly all of them, and sort of followed up, contacted city governments, and then eventually were able to collate this group of 37 heat action plans. So it's the first kind of proto repository. One of our first arguments, our first recommendation is let us create an openly accessible, updated repository of heat action plans, because this is a transparency and accountability issue, right? If you have a major heat death event, you want to know what was on paper, who was responsible for it, what sort of solutions need to be implemented going forward. It just changes the entire conversation when there's like one piece of paper that says this is what needs to be done. And even during the deaths in Navi Mumbai, which was last month, 14 people passed away. There was, in the days after, there was confusion about whether a heat action plan existed or not, what it said. And then eventually, I think a very enterprising journalist was able to get their hands on it and figure it out. But it shouldn't be like that. There should be enough transparency in the system that you know that there is a heat action plan that needs to be done. The methodology we followed was, we knew this was sort of first of its kind assessment. And one part of it, the first bit of it, was just to understand the range of solutions that were being proposed in Indian heat planning, right? And one of the things is, as you go through these reports, you'll notice that they propose hundreds and hundreds of different solutions, right? Build a pond, increase urban shade cover, have cooling centers in various places, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was clear that we were operating in a fairly expanded landscape of solutions. And we came into this, people said, oh, these are all copy-paste documents. But it wasn't actually that way, right? Like, there was enough heterogeneity between these documents to suggest that there was some bottom-up thinking going on. So the idea was like, can we put all these solutions in one place and come up with this palette of heat solutions that India has come up with now that we have this data set? So that was one part of it. The second part of it was, can we understand how heat is characterized, right? Because heat is notoriously difficult to pin down in terms of what the problem actually is. Because there's the dry heat, 49 degrees, we all feel it, skin is burning, that's a problem. But equally, if it's 37 degrees and 80% humidity in coastal wherever, that's a problem too. So then 38 degrees is a problem, it's not just 49. And it's the amount of exposure you have to it, right? So if you're exposed 6 hours to wet pub temperatures, then, there's a very high chance you'll end up in a bad place. Then there's a question of, have you been able to rest at night? So how warm was the night? And how warm the night is then connected to the amount of cloud cover and a bunch of other variables. And so then that's part of the problem. And then there's all these second order questions about how the society is structured in the context of that heat, right? So that was the other part of it. But we want to understand how heat was considered and looked at as a physical phenomenon. And then the second part of the second subset of heat as a problem was, how do these heat action plans understand the social structure heat is placed in, right? So do they have a sense of what the socioeconomic conditions are? Do these heat action plans make an attempt to do a vulnerability assessment to identify what the vulnerability map looks like who has access to electricity, who has access to air conditioning, who has access to water, right? What sort of jobs do they do, right? In this neighborhood, which is completely concrete, with no tree cover are 80% of the people actually construction workers? And do they come back at night to tin roofed houses? Right. So the heat action plan needs to note that level of granularity. Right? It's like street by street, ward by ward, understanding of what vulnerability looks like. So this was the characterization of heat as a problem. And then the third part of the assessment framework is about the implementation prospects, right? The viability of implementation. So this is nuts and bolts stuff. Does it create an institutional structure? Does it create a command and control hierarchy? Does it bring regular vulnerable people who are heat affected into the conversation when they're revising a plan? Do they put money behind it? And what is the legal force behind the heat action plan? So that was the third part of the methodology. So we put each of these heat action plans through these methodological filters to try and understand how well they stacked up. But something we had to create sort of, there aren't too many examples of similar methodologies. So one of the things we're hoping is that post this report, when other people pick this up, that they build on this methodology and expand it or change certain components of it in other country contexts, or even in India, if this study is repeated again, because it's really like a first cut and it's very rough around the edges and so on. So
that's wonderful. Before we really talk about your interesting recommendations, a couple of which I really like, I have one more of like methodological question, which is and I'm not an expert on, the resilience, climate resilience part, but I know that there are like some rapid events and then slow onset events, when you think about impacts. So does the heat action plans that have been made, are they only focused on the rapid events part, or they also look at the slow, onset events like drought, which may or may not be visible, like, a storm, for example?
Yeah. So universally, these heat action plans are structured around the heat wave event, right? And so this is a very technically bounded, defined construct of time, which is the heat has to go beyond a certain temperature threshold for a set number of days, and then a heat wave is declared. And when those conditions no longer exist, then the heat wave declaration stops. And there are huge amounts of emergency resources that are supposed to be mobilized in this bounded period of a few days or maybe a week, God forbid, more than a week, because then you start seeing the limits of the machinery being able to function, I guess. But it happens in that time. But there is a but to this answer, which is the range of solutions that are proposed. Like, let's have cool roofs and let's have urban trees in areas which are extremely heat exposed. Let's have heat resilient crops. Let's make sure irrigation is more efficient. These are things that can guard against slow onset events, right? So those are things that have potential co-benefits with the droughts. It has potential co-benefits with just general livability. It might increase real estate prices. I will almost surely increase real estate prices when there's more urban tree cover, right? So these are things that can have all of these other positive benefits as well. But the way it's structured and the intellectual focus of the heat action plans is almost always the heat wave itself. And the origin of the heat action plan is very much in the public health literature. So these are public health documents that are now springing these new facets that cover other parts of the economy. So yeah, still evolving, the idea of a heat action plan. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It seems like it's still evolving. I feel like as both the scientific field, but also the implementation field evolves, there may be co-benefits to even focusing on one that may zoom into the other. I know Shreya's dying to ask another question, so I'll let her.
I just wanted to ask, in these, all the HAPs that you analyze, was there any of the HAP that is like, not perfect would be the right word, but which will suited to the problem the most? Or any global examples that you have that HAP makers should analyze before they make a plan for their own locality or state? I have one more addition to the question, but let's start with this.
Yeah, I'm glad you phrased it that way, right? It's about how suited is it to the problem rather than is there a best or like best in class. And there was some that actually made more of an effort to understand the local context in which heat is operating and build solutions from that understanding of it, right? So there were a couple of HAPs. I think there are about 3 heat action plans in this country now that have vulnerability assessments and actually do that ward by ward kind of understanding of where are the people who are most likely to be affected by a heat wave. It's so crucial to have this vulnerability assessment because you might have this whole list of solutions. But if you don't know where to give the heat wave alert, where to do the capacity building of telling people this is what a heat wave is and this is what it'll do to your body and so on. If you don't know which neighborhoods to go into, if you don't know where to plant the trees, then you're going to end up in a city of 20, 25 million people. You're going to end up doing this stuff in the wrong place and the heat wave comes and you really don't have any way of actually knowing how to respond, where to go, but also your solutions have been certain, right? So all these long-term solutions that are building, like changing a building code and like investing in subsidies for changing glass facades, buildings and so on, none of that will work, right? So that's the key. And the vulnerability assessment is really at the core of this. Some other plans did actually really well on trying to think through the financial stuff, right? Local governments really don't have a whole lot of options when it comes to financing things, especially things that are outside the purview of day-to-day governance. And heat is one of those things that is presently outside the purview of day-to-day governance. And I guess we can define what that means, but they do think about, can we use Finance Commission grants, for example, in interesting ways? Because the Finance Commission has this whole conversation about disaster management. And they have a lot of money now allocated to disaster preparedness, not just response. So there are states that are actually using that already for heat. There are states that actually have fairly sophisticated monitoring frameworks. So they're building this backbone of data reporting from hospitals across the state, bringing it to a central place. There's also, at the national level, we have a national mission on climate change and human health, which is put pass-through requirements on hospitals. They have state and district officers who collect death data, which is hugely important. So this kind of backbone building work, again, not as visible as a tree or a cool roof, but very important for the future. Some of them do a very good job on that, right? So at the moment, I think if you ask me what my impression is, it's that different HAPs do different things at different levels of efficiency and proficiency. And if you were kind of able to level everybody up to roughly the same level on all these different fronts, you'll actually have a pretty good heat response, right? If everyone gets to the level of roughly the best in category for vulnerability assessments and financialization, so on and so forth, if you set that sort of indigenous bar, right? We're not saying, okay, this is what the bar should be. If you say, can you get up to the level of even 80% of what this state has done for this, you'll actually have a pretty sophisticated response. There's some other things that need to be done, but it's not so far off the mark at the moment for this early stage of planning, right? So it's this early stage of policy planning. 10 years from now, it'll be wholly inadequate. At this point, does it feel like the battle is lost just yet?
This is just out of curiosity as you were talking, and it made me realize this. Do you think the problem in financing a heat action plan, or maybe the government to sit up and take notice, is also because how local and state governments function in the country? It's very much in silos, and heat waves typically, how do you define them? Is it a health department's problem? Is it a civic problem? Is it an urban infrastructure problem? Which department should handle it? For that matter, which department should actually create a file of heat action plan, submit it to get some money? And then how much money should get disbursed to, say, the forestry department or to public works department, etc.? Do you think that also is somehow the core of the problem? And then how does one addresses it? How would a state government address it?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head, right? This is one of those problems that is cross-departmental. And in fact, the broader climate policy architecture has exactly this problem, right? When you try to create climate policy, right? So climate as in not okay, this is climate adjacent policy. It has some relevance to climate. You're actually trying to create climate institutions and policies. It has exactly the same problem. It's multi-departmental, lacks financing, all of that. You are absolutely right. That's where the problem begins. And you see a variety of different methods being used in these heat action plans. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that no single person holds complete responsibility for the heat portfolio. So at best, you get coordinators of a heat action plan, but you don't get one department creating the entire architecture. And I'm pretty sure, again, not something I know, but just anecdotally, it seems like heat action plans suffer from all the same coordination problems one would expect from a multi-departmental exercise. The trick seems to be in defining heat action as a disaster action. So if heat were to be classified as a disaster, then it automatically solves some of these problems. So a heat wave then becomes a disaster. It falls under the Disaster Management Act, right? NDMA and SDMA to get sort of a clear eye on what needs to be done, how to solve it. There's also now, because of the Finance Commission, like I was saying earlier, there's also the possibility of getting preparedness funding for it. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether it needs to be declared a disaster to get the preparedness money, but it definitely needs that to do the relief, to fund the relief actions and work out how to actually implement the heat action plan during a heat wave. At the national level, heat is not a disaster. There are a set of defined disasters through a Home Ministry notification. Heat is not one of them. I think there's a question about how one would define this as a disaster. Because if you look at it by the data, heat deaths have been declining. And this is a fairly interesting, I think, intellectually challenging conversation about why heat deaths have been declining. Because at some level, it might be just that the mortality data collection is not working. It might also be that there is very high level of personal adaptation and historical adaptation. It might just be the structure of Indian society, because you don't have large amounts of atomization and loneliness. You don't have the same problem as in Europe, where it's essentially elderly people in apartments that are the highest at risk, and you have that sort of data and evidence from historically starting in the early 1990s with heat waves in developed countries. There's a whole conversation about how you define the disaster. One case that could be made is that these are huge economic damages. So you use the loss and damage route here too, and then define it possibly as a disaster. But then someone has to make the case. Right? Nobody has added up all the numbers and ever come up with a dollar figure, rupee figure for the damages from a heat wave. We still don't know what March, April, May 2022 was. We know 4% wheat, we know wheat exports, we know rice. We know all of that. Rice was later, but we know all of this stuff. We don't actually have a number, right? So there's this question about defining the disaster. It might be one way of bringing some more authority to the heat file, but there's a question about whether that is always useful, right? So states have started doing this. So in the absence of a national disaster declaration, states have done it. Over half a dozen, though we don't know the number for sure, over half a dozen have declared it at the state level as a disaster. So that brings them some of these benefits of response. But different states have different governance architectures. And so it's not clear whether always having it defined as a disaster is the best way to do it, right? I could well imagine if the political constitution of a state is such that the health department might actually be the one that does this best, right? It's hard to answer. I think it's a state-to-state question.
Let me steer this in a little bit of more international context. So if we link, the heat action plans, the whole problem of heat to loss and damage, do you have any expectation that international finance can come in here to support some of the initial finance work on this? Or have you thought about that, not just in terms of like mobilizing domestic schemes and resources to fund this stuff, but any innovative ideas, including international finance, that can fund heat action plans of the future?
The loss and damage question is a loaded one, right? Because I think, answering this question now, pre-COP28, pre-future COPs, before the fund has been filled, it's hard to say. My suspicion is it's not going to be filled to anywhere near the level that's necessary to address the range of losses and damages that countries are feeling. And then there's this question about developing countries versus NDCs, small island states. How do you split the pie? And then there's a question about the type of disaster, right? So if you're looking at heat, the way I think about heat in the L&D conversation is, if this is not like parts of a city being submerged, if this is not a bridge collapsing, this is not buildings falling down, the way one would see in a climate apocalypse movie, but this is this, hidden threat. It's working its way insidiously. It's almost like a cancer working its way through the body politic, right? Even in the absence of deaths, you still see damages. How does one make that case convincingly, especially in light of the fact that buildings are falling and mountainsides are collapsing and dams are bursting and all of those things also losses? Like there are all of these things about the actual loss of climate change, which is physical and manifested. So I feel personally, I'm happy to prompt this debate, but personally, I feel like heat will always be at the lower end of this, despite having very broad-ranging multi-sector impacts affecting nearly everybody, especially the poor, right? It's not a lesser problem in terms of the actual rationality of it. It's just the fact that it's not as visual and documentable, I think, is the problem. In terms of international funding, though, that's a different story, right? I definitely think there is scope for international funding being used for adaptation projects that have mitigation co-benefits. Right? And the whole urban tree thing, urban reforestation plan is one of those things. I definitely see, for example, the prospect, and this is something that I think is hugely necessary, but a real conversation about what it takes to have super energy efficient, frugal air conditioning that is also possibly and hopefully powered by renewables. I feel like that's the direction this is going. I mean, the conversation about passive cooling and all aside, the fact is air conditioners are here and we're reaching that inflection point and growth is like doubling, tripling, all of that stuff. International support could definitely be useful in unlocking what Indian air conditioning in the future looks like, right? In a way that is not creating a massive maladaptation problem for the world. I think there are bits and pieces of the heat puzzle that can be solved through international financing, international technical support, but I don't think it's a loss in damage.
During this conversation, we have put many agencies under a spot. Let's put one more, and that is weather. There is this criticism or complaint, for that matter, that there is a lack of long-term reliable weather forecasting in this country. Apart from that, how weather forecasting was done, say, a decade back globally has changed completely. These words like heat waves and cold waves, etc., has made into the parlance of the global meteorological organization that you see, but not here. Why I cite this is that the Mumbai incident that we discussed, the temperature wasn't that high, is something that everyone was saying. It was very humid and it was something we call as a wet bulb temperature, me and you, something that a layman doesn't know. Probably those people making heat action plan also might not be aware or aware. So weather forecasting has a big role to play in it, I guess. Also change the whole perception about that heat wave is not just a high mercury. It is a lot of things that you also mentioned during this conversation. Would you like to comment on this? What role weather forecasting can play in this?
Yeah, sure. Actually, this is in the course of this work, we've been exposed to the IMD, the Indian Meteorological Department's efforts at heat, and we're constant, like our team at CPR is constantly consuming the stuff that they put out. So, and we've had the benefit of having conversations with them about this, right? The heart of this is that the heat wave forecasting time that they can forecast to reasonably accurately is now about 5 days, which is actually probably enough to boot up some of your immediate responses that you need to deal with an extreme heat situation. And so they put these out every day, right? So every day on various WhatsApp groups, on the website, there's a press release and all of that. That's a big step forward, right? Just having it out there. There's a second question about how that gets disseminated. And that's where the problem actually starts, because how do you get this to the last person that's going to be affected by heat? That's a hugely complex, hugely institutionally challenging, also, I suspect, a politically challenging thing to do in terms of navigating all the way down to a local government, every heat stress district in the country. So the forecasting is better. In terms of the humidity and the wet bulb conversation, again, I mean, this is not something I'm an expert on, but they are trying to apparently create models that put heat and humidity together and create some sort of heat index prediction to show where the heat index is going to be worse for the next coming days. And as far as I understand, this is an ensemble approach where they're using many models and trying to understand the strength of this. And it's complicated because you don't have enough temperature data and you also don't have a clear sense of how the humidity is functioning. Now, in the last couple of weeks, the updates have included an experimental heat index forecast, which actually says, and so one of the things was in Andhra, a couple of days ago, there was a heat wave alert. And you could actually see that the experimental forecast was suggesting that there would be pretty high humidity threat also from there. So it's moving forward incrementally. I think my sense of it is again, just from the outside looking in, my sense of it is this is actually a pretty challenging thing to do, to actually forecast this, because it's tricky, right? If you forecast this wrong too many times, it's a problem. But if you don't forecast it right, like, you can't forecast it right because you just know temperature station there. Like, you just don't have the data. This is data black spot. You just like extended your analysis from whatever the known data was to the unknown area just by averaging it out or whatever. Not that that's what they do, but it was just me sort of thinking out loud. That becomes a problem as well, right? So it's a tricky thing. It seems to be an institutional focus within the IMD. I mean, they seem to be trying to work on this. But let's see how it goes. I mean, I think the next couple of years we'll actually get a very clear sense. By the end of the decade, I think we'll have a very clear sense of whether the forecasting is actually working and to what extent. It's actually a great area for research also, by the way. I mean, the Met guys, it's actually a very good area for research.
So, if I were to ask the key recommendations or the ideal HAP, what it would look like, Indian context, more or less covering problems of most of the states, what would it look like? Can you give some key points, key recommendations on it?
Yeah, I think the ideal HAP would be based on a lot of mortality data and maybe even morbidity data, in the sense that it actually understands at what temperature people start dying or people start getting very sick. For that, you actually need to be completely plugged into the healthcare system and be able to source all of this data and pull it out. And then establish the threshold temperature at which things usually start going bad. So historically, at this temperature, in these conditions, in this place, we start seeing an X percentage increase in mortality. So this is when the heat wave should be declared, right? The data burden there is very high, but hopefully Indian HAPs get to a point where they're able to collect enough data to establish true temperature thresholds to understand when the problems decay. Right now in the country, what happens is it's all based on a national level heat wave threshold, which may or may not be valid for that particular place, right? So you might have a threshold that is too high and people actually start dying earlier because there's no local data. And it's entirely unclear how this national threshold has been set. Like, what data has been used to set the national threshold. And I've tried finding out a couple of times. It's not clear how we ended up with these various numbers that are baked into all these heat action plans. The data set is not clear. It's also not clear if mortality was figured at all because there is no real mortality data, right? So how was this created? Do we need a drastic revision of the national level mortality thresholds for heat waves, let alone the localization? The second big thing, and we discussed this earlier, is the vulnerability assessments, right? Like, if you have a whole range of solutions, you have to know where to direct them. For that, you have to know where the folks most exposed to heat or most vulnerable to heat are, right? If it's a pregnant woman, and we saw recently, just a couple of days, it was an incredibly tragic story of a pregnant tribal woman who was trying to access healthcare, getting to a primary healthcare center, 9 months pregnant. Both her and the baby died because of heat stroke, right? You have to know where that person is and you have to know how to protect them. If not, like, the state being there itself, at least have like a social structure within which he can be dealt with. That's the vulnerability conversation, and having vulnerability assessments hugely important. And the third big thing I would say is actually making sure that there is transparency and inclusiveness in this. And I know these are words that you always see in reports, and it's like, okay, everyone be transparent and inclusive, right? It's a platitude almost sometimes. But the fact is, we saw it, right? We saw it in Mumbai. If you don't know what's on paper, then you could end up with people dying. And this is one of the things we tested the HAPs for. We tried seeing how many heat action plans actually brought regular people into the room, heat exposed people into the room when they were revising the heat action plan. Like, on paper, do you have a requirement that you at least go out and ask the question that, has this reached you? Or like, has this heat action plan reached you? And we found that nearly none of them, maybe all, I don't remember exactly, but use that approach to revising the heat action plan, right? So at most, there's a committee structure that's formed with heads of departments. They come together once a year, a new heat action plan is put out. There isn't a bottom-up sourcing of this stuff. And the fourth bit that I would hope to see in heat action plans is about the institutionalization of this. Can you build sustainable finance mechanisms? What Sandeep was talking about, right? Can you creatively harness international linkages? Can you creatively harness what the Finance Commission is doing? There's a National Adaptation Fund on Climate Change, which is run by NABARD, which has money in it. Can you use that? Can you figure out ways of tying this into state schemes and centrally sponsored schemes? So centrally sponsored schemes are upwards of I think there are about 60 of them across the country at the moment. And this is many lakhs of crores that are being pumped into the states. Like some of that could surely be used in heat. And the final part of it, I think, would be to ask how to build legal foundations around heat action plans. And this is about enforceability and accountability again. The question is whether you want a separate heat law, and I think many people have the feeling that a heat law won't really be complied with, it'll just be another law on paper. So can you harness different sectoral laws for individual solutions? Right? Can you tie it into the Water Act or the Environmental Protection Act, and can you tie it into whatever exists in the housing sector? So different sectoral schemes kind of create this interlacing structure around the HAP. Rather than the HAP have this sort of law running through it, can you embed it in different things? And internationally, one of the things is, for example, with the California Heat Action Plan, one of the big lessons, I think, is the idea of creating a research and development ecosystem around heat. And that includes everything from understanding how heat affects the human body to understanding what low-cost, energy-efficient air conditioning might look like, or just generally how to solve the heat problem without blowing a hole in both our pockets and in the atmosphere. Right?
This is awesome. I know we had a lot of things to talk about, but before we end, I have one last question. Both as a scholar, but also as a practitioner, explain to me what are the next set of research that would be helpful in this field, but also what are the set of actions, which would be useful. So not just research for providing evidence, but then taking that to the ground.
Where to start, on the research front, and this is actually just me channeling a whole bunch of conversations with other people who've done research and doing research and feel the need for research out there. This will go on for a while. But just very swiftly to rattle it off, I think we need far more research on excess mortality and understanding what excess mortality looks like in heat wave conditions in multiple cities so we can build these temperature thresholds. We need to understand how different solutions perform, because right now we talk about urban afforestation being a great solution. Which trees in which places, don't really know. Somebody was talking yesterday at CPR about how cool roofs may not actually be the most effective thing, because if you have extremely cold winters, it could actually mess you up in the opposite direction. So each of these solutions needs a fair amount of research. And like I was talking about earlier, technological solutions and how to make them more accessible and more friendly. And actually, on the institutional side, and this is something we're hoping to pick up next in the next phase of this research, is actually understand whether these apps are being implemented, if not why. Because I feel there's a whole different story playing out in different states that needs to be addressed through a set of governance tweaks, right? You might need tweaks to Indian federalism itself to deal with climate impact, the structure of Indian federalism itself. And so we want to actually figure out what the implementation roadblocks are. And finally, I think there's a whole lot of medical research that needs to be done to understand exactly how heat interacts with different people at different times, right? Which we don't really know very well. Yeah, I think the first thing would be to do an independent evaluation of current plan implementation. That would really be the first thing, because everyone needs to figure out what exactly is working for them and not. There is no independent evaluation framework that's built into these heat action plans, right? And I think globally now, best practice in planning is moving in the direction of independent evaluations. And that's like the new governance fix. It's a new governance mantra. That would probably be the first one. And the second one would be, can you have locally established temperature thresholds? Third one would be, can you have local vulnerability assessments? So can you drive in the direction of localizing your HAPs rather than having something that is operating, if not at 30,000 feet, then at 15,000 feet? But you actually need this to be right there on the ground with the people who are being affected by this. Right? That's the challenge. It's not easy. It's not what governments are very good at, hyper-localized stuff, but that's what's needed.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you. I think a lot of graduate students will really benefit. You laid out some research questions in the end, So, hey, graduate students, if you're listening, this could be your PhD topics. But really, beyond that, I really appreciate your time. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation and great to have time to actually build on these points and discuss it with both of you. So really glad to be here.
Yeah, same here. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with a double I.